It's on the very low variance end and needs to be handled in a particular way because of that. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2020-2021 NBA season. I am Fast Eddie Fear. Over the last couple weeks, while I've been preparing for this season that we're now ramping up for, I've been observing a lot of conversations on the Twitter sphere. And there's been a lot of conclusions and theories about NBA basketball that I find to be at best misleading and quite possibly just wrong in a lot of cases. And I thought I would take a little time and release a few short videos talking about some observations I have, ways that my process may differ from other people's, and just some truths and secrets, if you will, about NBA DFS. So without further ado, this is our introduction. Nobody loses at NBA DFS. Now, that phrase, or the equivalent, everybody wins at NBA DFS, has been uttered ironically for the last few years because it no longer really applies, but it came into existence because it was true. It really was incredibly difficult to lose at NBA DFS for a number of years. And understanding why it was so easy and why it got so much harder is really a great entry point for understanding some of the topics we're going to talk about here. But the short version of it is that the answer for both of those things is that basketball is much more predictable of a sport than any other DFS sport, significantly. If you compare, let's say, LeBron James or another high-profile basketball player to a football player or a baseball player of similar stead, the distribution of scores that they get are so much more centralized with a basketball player, it's not even necessarily close. If you look at Mike Trout over the last couple of years, there are 20 games where he'd play a full game and score 0 fantasy points because he has 4, 5, 6 plate appearances. Those are his only opportunities to score. So if you're going to fail 60-65% of the time, every few games you're just going to throw up a big 0, and plenty of the time you'd get almost nothing. If you look over the last few years, in games where LeBron plays a full game, doesn't get injured, doesn't get foul trouble, isn't rested after a few minutes, just plays a quarter because of scheduling, any of that crap, he's scored less than 30 fantasy points once, less than 40 fantasy points like a handful of times. He has scored between 45 and 70 fantasy points 90% of the time. And that completely changes the entire mathematical underpinning of managing the sport in DFS. We'll talk about how it was 5 years ago versus how it is now. But the reason that occurs is because basketball, unlike almost all these other sports, instead of having these opportunities to score a huge number of points very few times, has many opportunities to score very few points. In your average NBA basketball game, we'll use LeBron again, he's going to have somewhere between 15 and 25 shots and make about half of those, give or take a little bit. He's going to have 20 opportunities to get a rebound, get about half of those on average. He's going to have about 20 opportunities to get an assist, get about half of those on average, maybe a couple steals, maybe a couple blocks. And those are worth a point and a half, 2 points. All these little things add up and give you a much more secure middle ground distribution of production. So how did that cause things to be so easy and then to get so difficult? Well, 5 or 6 years ago, the number of people who had even baseline understanding of DFS relative to the size of the fields was pretty small. It's important to start as a caveat by saying everything was easier back then. Between incentives and overlay and givebacks and rakeback and promotions and marketing and all the things the sites were doing as the industry was exploding 5 years ago, there was basically no rake. So over the course of a month or a year or any extended period of time, about half players were profitable. And that included most of the players with any basic understanding of algorithms or math or paying attention. So the majority of players who would be discussing such a thing on Twitter would say things like, everybody wins at NBA DFS, and it was true. It was really, really difficult to lose because you could just play it on its belly. You could just do the obvious thing, and it worked. because only, I don't know, 10, 20% of players and only 40, 50% of entries were based on just the really good lineup. Just salary divided by expected fantasy points. That just wasn't out there. There were enough people as the industry was getting bigger and bigger. There were enough fish in the pond that the sharks could eat every day very, very easily. And it was a great time. If I could go back and tell myself something 7, 8 years ago, it would be to bet the house, because it was impossible to lose. And that was basically it. You could just play the best players. And there was enough non-chalk out there, and the chalk, the obvious plays, came in so often. You could just bet the favorites. You could just be like, this is the best lineup. Play it, and you'd win. You'd win GPP sometimes. You didn't have to get super cute. So what happened? Well, again, the amount of rake went from functionally 0% to functionally 15% for most of us who would be playing just GPPs. And additionally, the degree to which the field was educated and knew what they were talking about got massively, exponentially better. Content sites, sharing, Twitter accounts. All of a sudden, instead of the example we talked about before, now you've got a scenario where 50 or 60% of players and 94% of entries are based on a solid mathematical foundation of who's going to be good. And at that point, when only 20% of people are going to get paid, it is a losing proposition to just run the chalk out there. So that was really the combination and the confluence of things that over time caused us to move from nobody loses at NBA DFS to now where that's spoken ironically, and to the fact that because it is so unique, you could look at DFS on a spectrum across all the sports, and there's a lot of people who work on a lot of sports. I just work on basketball now because it's its own unique fish. It's at one end of this mathematical spectrum as far as variance goes. It's on the very low variance end and needs to be handled in a particular way because of that. So we'll call it there for the introduction. I'll be back later today, I imagine, with Chapter 1 of this brief video series, and I look forward to seeing all of you soon.